An elderly black man sat in silence as the plane prepared for its journey, his weathered hands folded neatly, his gaze steady yet distant. To the casual eye, he looked ordinary, a tired traveler fading into the background. But to the man beside him, he became a target. The ridicule started subtly, a careless sprawl of limbs, a drink spilled without apology, crumbs shaken onto gray hair as if dignity itself could be reduced to dust. What no one around them realized was that the silence of the one being humiliated was not surrender, it was control. Hidden beneath that calm exterior was a truth so devastating that when it surfaced, the balance of power in the cabin would shatter instantly. The bully who mocked him would be left stripped of arrogance, and the passengers who stayed quiet would be forced to confront what they had witnessed. Keep watching, because what seems like just another flight will turn into a reckoning no one expected. Make sure to like this video, subscribe for more stories of injustice turned on its head, and tell me in the comments if you felt the tension building and where you are watching from. The flight had only just begun to settle into its rhythm when the subtle discomforts of the journey revealed themselves. The engines hummed with steady force, the cabin lights glowed faintly above rows of strangers, and the scent of strong coffee mixed with the metallic tang of recirculated air. Passengers adjusted pillows, unfolded blankets, and pulled out books or laptops in attempts to pass the hours ahead. Among them, in a quiet row near the middle of the aircraft, sat Eldridge Coleman, a 72-year-old black man with a calm presence and a composed dignity carved into every line of his face. His clothes were modest, neat, and pressed, and his silver hair was combed with care, evidence of a man who still took pride in his appearance even while traveling. He carried himself with the patience of someone who had endured a lifetime of both triumphs and struggles, and although his body was frilier than it had once been, his presence still carried a quiet strength. Seated beside him was Sterling Vance, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s whose expression carried the smug assurance of entitlement. Even before the seatbelt light had dimmed, Sterling had made his intentions clear. With practiced arrogance, he spread himself wide, shoulders leaning across the shared armrest, knees pushing hard into Eldridge's space, feet sprawling as though the seat next to him was his by right. His presence pressed into Eldridge's carefully guarded boundary until the old man had no choice but to shift closer toward the window. Sterling didn't bother hiding his smirk. The act of crowding his neighbor was deliberate, a show of power dressed as casual indifference. As the flight attendants began their initial rounds, Sterling lifted his cup of coffee with careless flourish. The movement was exaggerated, and when the liquid sloshed, the result was as predictable as it was cruel. A stream of dark fluid dripped down onto Eldridge's sleeve, soaking the fabric in an instant. Sterling didn't flinch or apologize. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, watching the stain spread while the corner of his mouth curved upward in a smirk. It was a performance of disdain, an insult delivered not with words but with action. And he enjoyed the thought that no one else had noticed. Eldridge quietly dabbed at his sleeve with a napkin, his hand steady, his face unreadable. He did not scowl or snap or even sigh. His silence was not weakness, but a form of control, a choice to maintain dignity in the face of contempt. Sterling read that composure as submission and grew bolder, shifting once again to press his thigh against Eldridge's, letting the old man know that there would be no peace in this row. Around them, other passengers remained absorbed in their own distractions. A woman flipped through a magazine with glossy pages, a man typed on his laptop, a teenager pushed earbuds into his ears and disappeared into his music. The cruelty unfolding at row 21 was invisible to most, yet to Eldridge it was heavy and sharp, a weight pressing on his spirit. Sterling reveled in that invisibility. He thrived on acts too small for witnesses to care about, but large enough to chip away at the dignity of the person beside him. Every adjustment, every sprawl of his body, every calculated movement was designed to remind Eldridge that his comfort meant nothing. When his tray table was lowered, he pulled a tissue from the packet he had been carrying, wiped it briskly across the surface, and then without hesitation dropped the crumpled paper onto Eldridge's polished shoes. The tissue clung to the leather for a moment before sliding to the floor, and Sterling didn't so much as glance down. He simply reclined with a satisfied smirk, tapping his fingers on the armrest as though his neighbor were invisible. Eldridge remained motionless, his posture erect, his eyes calm but distant, as if he had retreated into a world far away from the indignity around him. The cart reached their row, and a flight attendant with a polite but rushed smile offered trays of food. Eldridge received his carefully, offering a quiet nod of thanks, but Sterling snatched his own tray with exaggerated impatience. As the attendant moved on, Sterling glanced at the small dessert nestled on Eldridge's tray, a modest slice of cake wrapped in plastic. Without warning, Sterling reached across, tugged Eldridge's tray closer to himself, and plucked the dessert from its spot. He placed it on his own tray as though it were his by right, then shoved Eldridge's meal back toward him with such force that the utensils rattled. He did it with the carelessness of a man who saw no need to respect boundaries, not even those as basic as food that did not belong to him. Around them, a few passengers noticed but quickly turned their eyes away, unwilling to involve themselves in what appeared to be a petty conflict between strangers. In the closed environment of a plane, many chose silence over confrontation, preferring the comfort of avoidance to the discomfort of speaking up. Sterling thrived on that silence. He knew the performance of his contempt was shielded by the indifference of others, and each act seemed to inflate his sense of control. Eldridge picked up his fork with steady hands, unbothered outwardly, and continued to eat what remained of his meal with quiet dignity. His restraint only fueled Sterling's contempt. The younger man wanted a reaction, some sign that his cruelty had pierced the older man's composure, but all he found was silence. To Sterling, that silence meant victory, proof that Eldridge was powerless beneath his arrogance. As the meal service ended and trays were collected, Sterling leaned back and stretched once more, pressing his elbow deliberately against Eldridge's ribs before drawing away, as though it had been an accident. He shifted his legs again, knocking against Eldridge's with more force than necessary, then turned his head toward the aisle with a smirk that betrayed his satisfaction. He wanted Eldridge to feel small, wanted him to shrink further into a seat, wanted him to exist only as the target of mockery. The quiet contempt continued with every small gesture. When a stewardess brought fresh cups of water, Sterling placed his own cup securely on the tray, then nudged Eldridge's cup toward the edge until it tipped slightly, threatening to spill. Only the quick reflexes of the elderly man prevented the water from staining his pants. Sterling gave a faint laugh, low and cruel, before pretending to scroll through his tablet as though nothing had happened. It was not enough to dominate the man beside him. Sterling needed to push harder, to prove to himself and to anyone watching that Eldridge was beneath him. As the cabin lights dimmed slightly and passengers settled into the routine of the flight, Sterling found new opportunities to intensify the humiliation. He opened the overhead bin above their row, pretending to adjust his bag, but instead he jerked it roughly, so that small crumbs and dust cascaded down like sand onto Eldridge's carefully groomed gray hair. The particles clung to his jacket and shoulders, marking him with an indignity that Sterling relished. He snapped the bin shut with unnecessary force and leaned back into his seat, casting a sidelong glance at Eldridge to gauge his reaction. The older man remained motionless, brushing his sleeve quietly, his eyes fixed forward with the same restraint he had shown before. Sterling, frustrated by the lack of visible anger, leaned closer and pulled a sleek bottle from his carry-on bag. With deliberate flourish, he sprayed a heavy mist of cologne around his seat, letting the sickly sweet and overpowering scent fill the narrow space. The air became thick and choking, designed to suffocate Eldridge with its intensity. Sterling capped the bottle with satisfaction, placing it back in his bag with exaggerated care, as if the act had been nothing more than an innocent refresh. Eldridge coughed lightly but remained silent, adjusting his collar to let in some air, still refusing to offer the outburst Sterling craved. Sterling's contempt grew sharper. He leaned forward, tapping his fingers along the back of the seat in front of him, creating a rhythm that reverberated into Eldridge's space. Each motion was designed not for comfort but for irritation, a childish game turned cruel under the circumstances. He shifted in his seat with sudden jerks, bumping Eldridge's arm with unnecessary force before stretching as though trying to shake off invisible stiffness. The message was clear. Eldridge's presence was an obstacle to be mocked, not respected. Eldridge, however, adjusted himself with the patience of someone who had faced storms far worse than the cruelty of one arrogant passenger. He dabbed again at his sleeve, dusted his shoulders, and returned to his stillness. His hands rested calmly on his lap, his eyes tracing the faint clouds beyond the window. Sterling could not comprehend how a man could endure so much humiliation without anger, without protest, without a single word of defiance. To him, silence was proof of weakness. He misread dignity as surrender, and his arrogance grew unchecked. As the flight continued, Sterling sought more ways to amplify the humiliation. He purposely shifted his water bottle onto Eldridge's side of a shared space, letting condensation drip onto the older man's leg. He adjusted his tray table, pushing it forward with just enough force to jostle Eldridge's hands as he tried to rest. He took out a packet of crackers, broke them roughly, and let the crumbs scatter across Eldridge's lap once again. Each act was delivered with the same cold precision, the satisfaction of cruelty dressed in the appearance of accident. To the inattentive eye, Sterling looked careless. To Eldridge, it was deliberate and cutting, a relentless test of his patience. The passengers around them began to notice. A woman across the aisle frowned as she watched Sterling let the crumbs fall. A man 2 rows back shook his head as the overpowering stench of cologne spread through the cabin. A few exchanged glances, but still no one spoke. The plane was a sealed world in which confrontation carried a price, and most chose to pay with silence. Sterling thrived in that environment, convinced he was invisible behind the indifference of strangers. Eldridge endured it all. His silence became a shield, his patience a weapon Sterling did not recognize. He had not surrendered. He had chosen restraint, knowing that arrogance, such as Sterling's, eventually created its own downfall. For every crumb scattered, every drop of cologne sprayed, every shove and push of the armrest, the old man carried the quiet knowledge that storms always revealed their fury in time. Sterling leaned back once more, pleased with himself, satisfied that his performance of humiliation had gone unanswered. To him, the older man beside him was nothing more than an easy target, a symbol of weakness he could exploit for his own amusement. But the truth lingered just beneath the surface, unseen by Sterling, but clear in the unwavering posture of Eldridge Coleman. Dignity cannot be broken by cruelty, and silence is not always defeat. It is the patience of someone who understands that arrogance burns itself out in the end. Sterling mistook that patience as surrender, and his arrogance pushed him to invent more ways to mock the older man. What began as small, petty gestures of disrespect had now evolved into calculated ridicule, subtle enough to be overlooked by most passengers, but sharp enough to stab at Eldridge with every passing minute. Sterling sat back in his chair, adjusting his posture with exaggerated comfort, then turned his head slightly toward Eldridge. He forced a cough from deep in his chest, covering his mouth with a tissue, and then pulled away with theatrical disgust, as if the air around the elderly man were contaminated. He repeated the gesture, coughing again, shaking his head, making a show of leaning away as though Eldridge himself were a source of illness. Other passengers glanced briefly in their direction, some frowning at the overdone display, but Sterling ignored them, convinced that his performance was clever, convinced that Eldridge's refusal to react meant victory. Eldridge remained still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes staring out of the window, refusing to acknowledge the insult. Unsatisfied with the lack of reaction, Sterling pressed further. He reached for the shared armrest, shoved it down hard, and forced Eldridge's thin arm to slip aside. The old man's elbow dropped abruptly, his frail hand dangling toward the floor. Sterling smiled to himself, stretching his arm across the rest as though he had conquered new territory. The gesture was petty, a small theft of comfort, but the satisfaction Sterling drew from it was immense. He shifted again, leaning his weight against the armrest so that it pressed firmly into Eldridge's ribs, the discomfort obvious yet unspoken. Eldridge simply adjusted himself slightly, reclaiming his composure without confrontation. Sterling's smile widened. To him, silence was defeat. To Eldridge, silence was resolve. The cabin continued to hum, with the white noise of engines and the murmurs of passengers lost in their own worlds. But the space in row 21 felt charged with tension. Sterling, emboldened, began to move with deliberate aggression. He shifted his tray table again, letting it fall with a loud snap against its hinge, startling those around them. He nudged his water cup just enough that a few drops spilled onto Eldridge's pants, then pretended to wipe his own hands clean, as though it were merely clumsiness. The pattern was clear. Every gesture that could be framed as an accident was in truth a weapon of ridicule, sharpened by the smirk that lingered on Sterling's lips. Eldridge brushed the water away quietly, his composure intact. Sterling leaned his head back, pretending to yawn, but his foot slid deliberately against Eldridge's shoe, pressing into it as though to claim the floor beneath him as well. He withdrew slowly, a faint chuckle slipping from his throat, pleased with his own cleverness. A woman across the aisle noticed the move and shook her head, her disapproval plain. Sterling ignored her. He lived for the silence of a cabin, the absence of direct confrontation, the unspoken rule that strangers avoided involvement. That silence was his shield, and he used it mercilessly. Eldridge remained calm, his breathing steady, his posture straight. He embodied restraint. He had no need to match Sterling's petty cruelty with anger, for he understood that arrogance burns itself out eventually. Yet each moment added to the growing weight of humiliation. He was not blind to it, nor was he immune. He bore it with the patience of someone who had seen cruelty before, someone who knew that storms eventually turn back upon those who create them. Sterling was relentless. He opened his laptop again, tilting the screen toward Eldridge so that its harsh glow shone directly into the older man's eyes. The bright light cut through the dimmed cabin, forcing Eldridge to squint, but he did not flinch or protest. He simply raised a hand slightly, shielding his eyes, then lowered it again, resuming his quiet gaze out the window. Sterling shifted his seat once more, rocking back against the cushion in a way that jostled Eldridge's chair, sending small vibrations into his body. He did it again and again, turning the comfort of the seat into yet another weapon of irritation. Still, Eldridge remained composed. His silence was unnerving to some passengers who began to watch more closely, realizing that the older man was enduring something beyond mere coincidence. Their glances lingered longer, their expressions harder to disguise. Sterling did not notice, or perhaps he did not care. He believed himself untouchable, shielded by arrogance and the unwillingness of strangers to intervene. The humiliation had moved beyond crumbs and spilled coffee. It was now in the cold ridicule of deliberate coughs, the theft of an armrest, the light of a screen turned into an instrument of discomfort. Sterling's contempt dripped from every motion, every calculated intrusion. To him, it was entertainment. To Eldridge, it was endurance. To the others who watched silently, it was becoming increasingly clear that cruelty was unfolding before them, piece by piece, act by act. He had no intention of letting the humiliation fade into routine. He needed to press harder, to prove to himself that the man beside him was powerless. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Passengers who had begun to notice Sterling's antics were no longer simply glancing and turning away. Some lingered, their gazes sharper, though still muted by the fear of confrontation in such a confined space. Sterling either failed to see it or chose not to care. His world was narrowed to the small space of row 21, and in that space, he imagined himself untouchable. The next act of contempt came when the attendants began to collect trash from the meal service. Eldridge had carefully folded his napkin and placed it on his tray, waiting with calm composure. Sterling reached for his own used napkin, greasy from handling crackers and crumbs, and with deliberate casualness, he tossed it onto Eldridge's tray. The oily stain spread across the surface, tainting what had been neat and orderly. Sterling smirked, stretching in his seat, as though the act were nothing more than convenience. Eldridge picked up the soiled napkin without complaint, placing it neatly onto the pile the attendant would collect, his movements deliberate and calm, refusing to give Sterling the satisfaction of visible offense. Sterling leaned back, tapping his fingers on the seat as the carts rolled away. His eyes scanned the cabin, but quickly returned to his chosen target. He reached for the overhead compartment again, not to adjust anything, but to jostle his own luggage so that a folded sweatshirt slipped halfway out. He gave the bag another shake, and the garment tumbled downward, landing squarely onto Eldridge's lap. Sterling chuckled under his breath, retrieving it slowly, brushing it against Eldridge's knees as though the man were little more than an object in his way. He shoved it back into the bin, slammed the compartment closed, and then reclined with smug satisfaction. Eldridge brushed his lap, straightened his jacket, and returned to stillness, the quiet anchor against Sterling's tempest of cruelty. The smirk on Sterling's face hardened into a sneer as his hunger for reaction grew. He reached for the in-flight magazine, flipped it open, and after a moment of exaggerated reading, dropped it carelessly onto Eldridge's legs as though they were a table. He let it rest there for several seconds before snatching it back, snapping the pages loudly, and slamming it into the pocket of the seat in front of him. Eldridge made no complaint. His silence was infuriating to Sterling, who wanted drama, wanted noise, wanted evidence that his mockery had pierced the old man's composure. The absence of that reaction only emboldened him. When the attendants moved through with blankets for those who requested them, Eldridge accepted one politely. He unfolded it with care, draping it across his lap and shoulders, settling into the small comfort it provided. Sterling's eyes narrowed. As soon as Eldridge adjusted himself, Sterling reached across, gripped the edge of the blanket, and tugged it sharply. The fabric slipped from Eldridge's lap, crumpling onto the floor of the aisle. Sterling bent over, picked it up, and instead of handing it back neatly, he balled it in his fists, twisted it, and dropped it unceremoniously at Eldridge's feet. A faint smirk curved his lips as he leaned back once more. Eldridge bent, retrieved the crumpled cloth, and carefully shook it out, placing it back over his knees as though Sterling's attempt at humiliation had not touched him at all. But deep inside, each act weighed heavier. Sterling reclined further, spreading himself again into the older man's space, knees angled outward, his elbow jabbing deliberately into Eldridge's side. He exaggerated every stretch, every adjustment, making the space feel smaller, narrower, suffocating. The arrogance in his body language was unmistakable, but Eldridge remained unmoved. He shifted slightly to reclaim what little space he had left, but his posture remained dignified. Sterling watched him from the corner of his eye, frustrated yet thrilled, savoring the game as though each round of cruelty were a personal victory. The passengers who watched grew uneasy. A young woman seated diagonally ahead bit her lip, her discomfort plain. A man across the aisle narrowed his eyes but turned back to his book, torn between intervention and silence. It was becoming harder to mistake Sterling's actions for coincidence. They were too frequent, too deliberate, too cruel. Eldridge bore it all with the same calm dignity, but the weight of the humiliation was becoming visible in the set of his jaw, the tightening of his hands. Sterling, oblivious or uncaring, pressed on. He reached for his earbuds, inserted them into his ears, and turned his music up to a volume so loud it leaked into the quiet hum of the cabin. The harsh beat rattled faintly against the air, but Sterling swayed in rhythm, tapping his knee against Eldridge's leg, drumming his fingers on the shared armrest, making certain the noise was not his alone. It was another invasion, another weapon of discomfort. Eldridge shifted slightly, his eyes closed now, as though summoning strength from within to endure without crumbling. The cruelty had grown from petty inconveniences into open hostility. What had begun as spilled coffee and stolen dessert had transformed into deliberate mockery, into stolen blankets, into magazines dropped like insults, into elbows and knees pressed with intent. Sterling's arrogance had no ceiling, and he reveled in the silence of those around him, convinced their unwillingness to intervene meant approval or at least apathy. He saw himself as untouchable, his cruelty unchecked, his smirk unchallenged. But the truth was shifting. Each act etched itself deeper into the memory of those who watched. Each petty cruelty grew more visible, more undeniable, more damning. Eldridge's silence, once misread as weakness, was slowly transforming into something else entirely, into a portrait of endurance, into a quiet defiance that would one day turn the weight of humiliation back upon the one who created it. The cabin had settled into the steady monotony of mid-flight. The hum of the engines droned like a lullaby, and many passengers reclined into uneasy rest, headphones on or eyes closed. In that dim calm, Sterling found fresh ways to test the endurance of his target. He reopened his laptop, not to work, but to wield it like a weapon. He angled the screen upward, tilting it so the harsh glow beamed directly into Eldridge's eyes. The brightness sliced through the dimmed cabin, forcing the older man to shield his face with his hand. Sterling pretended not to notice, tapping away at the keyboard with exaggerated strokes, smirking when Eldridge adjusted himself again to block the light. It was harassment disguised as habit, another test of patience. When that failed to provoke reaction, Sterling leaned back and began rocking in his seat. Each motion was subtle but deliberate, a rhythmic push that jolted the shared row. The vibrations traveled into Eldridge's body, disrupting his fragile rest, rattling through the blanket he had managed to reclaim. Sterling rocked harder, pretending to stretch, forcing Eldridge to tense his body against the repeated nudges. Eldridge shifted slightly, repositioning himself to absorb the disruption, but his composure did not crack. The quiet dignity with which he endured only infuriated Sterling further. He leaned forward again, reaching into the seat pocket, retrieving a packet of peanuts, and tearing it open with unnecessary force so that fragments flew onto Eldridge's lap. Sterling flicked the crumbs away with his fingers, brushing them against Eldridge's sleeve as though cleaning himself, and then chewed loudly with his mouth open, exaggerating every crunch. The sound carried through the quiet cabin, drawing disapproving glances, but Sterling ignored them. Eldridge brushed the crumbs off his lap with deliberate calm, his face expressionless, his eyes never straying from the horizon visible through the small oval window. Sterling was relentless. He stretched his arm across the back of the seats, the fabric of his sleeve brushing against Eldridge's shoulder, a calculated encroachment designed to claim even more of the older man's limited space. He pressed his foot further into the floor area, shoving against Eldridge's shoes until the older man was forced to tuck his feet beneath his chair. To Sterling, it was victory. To Eldridge, it was another silent tally on a ledger of cruelty that grew heavier with every passing hour. The arrogance of Sterling's performance became increasingly obvious to those seated nearby. A young woman 2 rows back whispered to her companion, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. The man across the aisle, who had turned away earlier, now watched with quiet disgust as Sterling leaned once again into Eldridge's space. The cabin was still a place of hesitation, where few dared to speak up, but awareness was spreading. Sterling believed himself untouchable, shielded by silence, but that shield was beginning to crack under the weight of too many witnesses. Undeterred, Sterling pressed on. He adjusted his tray table once more, dropping it down with a snap that jolted Eldridge's arm, then lifting it again only to slam it shut. He repeated the motion several times, pretending to fidget, each slam another stab at the man beside him. Eldridge sat still, his jaw tight, his composure unbroken, his silence as steady as it had been since the first spilled coffee. Yet there was a subtle shift now. The patience remained, but it was thinner, stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. Sterling sensed none of it. His arrogance blinded him, convinced him that his cruelty had reduced Eldridge to quiet submission. He had no idea that his performance was being memorized by those who watched, no idea that each petty act was another nail in the coffin of his assumed superiority. He mistook endurance for weakness and silence for surrender, failing to see that each act only magnified his own ugliness while preserving the quiet dignity of the man he sought to demean. The flight dragged on, and Sterling grew restless. He began to hum along with the music in his headphones, loud enough for Eldridge to hear the off-key notes vibrating in the air. He drummed his fingers against the armrest again, not with rhythm, but with irritating randomness, ensuring the vibrations shook through Eldridge's seat. He cracked his knuckles loudly, sighing theatrically, stretching his body with groans of exaggerated fatigue that always ended with an elbow or knee shoved into the older man's space. Eldridge endured all of it. His silence was not that of a broken man, but of a man who knew storms better than the storm maker himself. He had seen cruelty before, had lived through it in forms far worse than this, and though his body was old and frail, his spirit remained unbroken. Sterling could not see it. Sterling saw only what he wanted to see: a quiet man reduced to stillness, a victim who gave him the illusion of power. He could not see that the patience before him was a fire, not extinguished but controlled, waiting for the right spark to burn through the arrogance that mocked it. But what he mistook for weakness was not weakness at all. It was restraint, an iron patience forged in years of trials that Sterling could not even imagine. And as Sterling grew more arrogant, certain that the older man had been broken, something subtle began to shift. The balance of the row had tilted, the weight of contempt heavy, but it was about to falter as signs of something unexpected emerged. The cabin was quieter now, the steady drone of the engines filling the silence. Many passengers had retreated into restless sleep, but some remained awake, uneasy, their eyes lingering on row 21. The atmosphere felt charged, as though everyone sensed that the storm Sterling had created was approaching its own breaking point. Eldridge sat straight-backed, his hands folded, his silver hair still carrying faint traces of crumbs he had brushed away earlier. His face was calm, but there was a change in his bearing, a quiet authority that did not come from defiance, but from something deeper, something that had always been there, hidden beneath patience. When the chief flight attendant made her round, clipboard in hand, she stopped beside their row. She began marking off passenger numbers, but when she reached Eldridge's name, her hand stilled. Her eyes flicked to him, widening slightly, and for a moment her composed expression cracked into one of recognition. She adjusted herself quickly, straightening her posture, and her voice dropped into a more formal tone as she confirmed his presence. She lingered longer than necessary, her eyes carrying a glimmer of respect that did not escape the notice of those watching. Sterling, oblivious, leaned back and stretched with another smirk, convinced that the attendant's pause meant nothing. But the air around them had shifted. Someone recognized Eldridge, and that recognition carried weight. Moments later, another sign appeared. A man seated across the aisle, middle-aged with weathered features and a sharp gaze, noticed something on Eldridge's hand. It was the gold ring he wore, simple yet etched with a distinct insignia, the kind only those who had served would recognize. The man's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffened, and after a brief pause, he inclined his head respectfully. He adjusted his jacket, straightening himself in his seat as though acknowledging a superior without words. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. Sterling missed it, too wrapped in his arrogance to notice, but others in nearby rows caught the moment. A ripple of curiosity passed among them, quiet and unspoken, a recognition that the man who had sat silently enduring so much was not merely an ordinary passenger. Sterling, eager to continue his campaign, leaned forward again, tugging open his bag with exaggerated force and scattering more items across his tray. He shoved his elbow against Eldridge once more, repeating the same petty harassment. But the satisfaction felt different now. The smirk on his lips faltered slightly when he caught a glimpse of passengers staring, not at him but at Eldridge, their eyes filled not with pity but with an unfamiliar respect. Sterling brushed it off, convinced his dominance remained intact, yet the unease seeped into him like a crack in stone. The older man remained steady, his silence as unyielding as ever, but now it was laced with something else, something unmistakable to those who paid attention. It was not the silence of surrender, but of command, the kind of composure that came from a life of leadership, from years of carrying responsibility far beyond the confines of a cramped airplane cabin. Eldridge adjusted his posture slightly, resting his hand on the armrest once more, and even that small movement carried authority. The passengers who noticed sat straighter themselves, as though influenced by his presence. Sterling failed to see it, still blind in his arrogance, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. As turbulence rolled through the cabin, shaking the plane lightly, Sterling made another attempt at mockery. He clutched the armrest theatrically, exaggerating his reaction, then looked toward Eldridge as though expecting to see fear. But Eldridge remained calm, unmoved, his gaze steady as if turbulence were nothing more than a ripple on the surface of a pond. A few passengers noticed this too, their eyes shifting between Sterling's childish act and Eldridge's unshakable calm. In that moment, it became clear that the older man was not just another target of cruelty. His patience had not been silence born of weakness. It was something greater, a quality Sterling could not imitate. The chief attendant returned briefly, speaking quietly with another crew member, her eyes darting once more toward Eldridge. Their hushed tones carried an edge of reverence, though they did not make it public. Still, those close enough to see understood that the man who had been mocked and shoved was not ordinary. The respect he commanded was unspoken, but it lingered in every gesture of those who recognized him. The passengers had begun to notice the way the chief attendant paused at Eldridge's name, the way her composure shifted into respect, and the way another man across the aisle straightened and nodded solemnly at the sight of the gold ring on Eldridge's finger. Those subtle signs began to stir questions in the cabin, whispers of recognition, the first hints that the elderly black man enduring insult after insult was not just another passenger. Sterling, still blinded by arrogance, pressed on, but the balance of power was tilting, and the moment that would end his reign of cruelty was close at hand. The turbulence that had rattled the plane earlier returned with greater force. The aircraft jolted suddenly, cups rattled in cup holders, and overhead bins shook with the weight of luggage. Passengers stirred from sleep, some gripping armrests with anxious fingers. Sterling, never missing an opportunity to dramatize, clutched the seat in front of him with an exaggerated gasp, his eyes darting as though the turbulence were a personal attack. He cast a glance at Eldridge, expecting fear, expecting to see the old man's composure crack. But Eldridge remained calm, his hand steady, his posture unshaken, his gaze directed firmly ahead. His presence alone seemed to anchor those around him. The contrast was stark. Sterling flailed in mock panic, while Eldridge embodied unshakable steadiness, and passengers noticed. The whispers grew louder, curiosity mounting. The flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, securing loose items, offering reassurances. But it was the chief attendant who paused again at Eldridge's row, crouching slightly as she spoke softly to him, her tone filled with deference. Her hand brushed against the clipboard once more, her eyes searching his, her posture respectful in a way that contrasted sharply with her brisk efficiency toward everyone else. She nodded to him, as though receiving an unspoken instruction, before rising and signaling to another crew member. Sterling glanced between them, his smirk faltering for the first time, though he tried to mask it with a scoff. The turbulence subsided, but the air in the cabin had changed. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional, updating passengers on their altitude and reassuring them that the worst had passed. Yet when the door to the cockpit opened moments later, the captain himself stepped into the aisle, something unusual during flight. Murmurs rippled across the rows as eyes followed him. His gaze scanned the cabin before settling on Eldridge. And then, in an action that froze Sterling where he sat, the captain walked directly to their row and extended his hand with a formality that needed no explanation. The gesture was firm, deliberate, filled with unmistakable respect. Passengers watched in silence as Eldridge accepted the captain's hand with quiet composure. The captain's voice, carried through the nearby, rose as he addressed him not as a stranger, but as someone of standing, someone whose presence demanded acknowledgement. Though he did not raise his voice, the words were clear enough to reach Sterling's ears and those of everyone paying attention. Eldridge Coleman was not simply an old man on a flight. He was a retired three-star general of the United States Air Force, a man who had commanded thousands, a man whose leadership had shaped critical moments of history. The revelation rippled through the cabin like lightning splitting a dark sky. The whispers became a wave of astonishment as passengers realized the truth about the man who had been mocked and shoved, the man who had endured in silence while Sterling degraded him. Eyes that had once looked with pity now widened with respect, even awe. A few of the veterans on board, who had already sensed something, straightened fully, their expression solemn. One of them, seated just 2 rows back, lifted his hand in a crisp, respectful salute. Eldridge inclined his head in acknowledgement, his face calm but dignified, carrying the weight of decades of service without a trace of arrogance. Sterling felt his stomach twist. His smirk faltered entirely, replaced by an unease he could not hide. He had spent the entire flight treating a decorated general like refuse, humiliating him in front of others, confident in his own untouchable arrogance. Now the truth stood in front of him, undeniable, and the shield of indifference he had relied upon shattered. The silence of the passengers was no longer apathy, but judgment, heavy and piercing. The man he had mocked was not powerless. He was a figure of authority, a man respected by both crew and veterans alike, a man who had endured far greater trials than Sterling could ever comprehend. The captain spoke again, his voice filled with reverence, thanking Eldridge for his service. He placed a hand briefly on the older man's shoulder before returning toward the cockpit, but the message had been delivered to everyone who watched. The cabin no longer looked at Eldridge as a frail passenger. They saw him now for who he was, a man of extraordinary resilience, patience, and authority, who had endured cruelty with the composure of true strength. Sterling shifted uncomfortably, his bravado gone, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of the revelation. He reached for his water bottle, fumbling with it, desperate for a distraction, but his movements only betrayed his unease. He glanced around, but every eye he met carried condemnation. The whispers had stopped. The silence was heavier than before, but it was no longer protective. It was accusatory. The cabin had seen the truth, and Sterling's cruelty could no longer be dismissed as petty or overlooked as clumsy. It was now framed against the reality of who his victim was, and that reality left him exposed. Eldridge remained calm, his expression unchanged, his silence intact. He did not gloat, did not smirk, did not seek revenge in words or actions. He did not need to. His presence alone carried the weight of justice, and the knowledge of who he was enough to condemn Sterling without another word. The patience that Sterling had mocked had not been weakness, but the restraint of a man who understood dignity. Sterling had not been tormenting a silent victim. He had been exposing his own cruelty to the judgment of everyone around him. Sterling, who had built his sense of dominance on the silence of the passengers, now found himself stripped of that shield. The eyes that once avoided the cruelty unfolding in row 21 were now fixed on him, not with indifference, but with judgment. The weight of collective condemnation pressed down upon him, and for the first time since the flight began, he had no smirk to hide behind. Sterling fidgeted with his water bottle, his hands betraying the tremor he tried to disguise. He shifted in his seat, pulling his legs inward, trying to shrink into the space he had once claimed with such arrogance. The silence of the cabin was no longer the silence of apathy, but of witness, heavy and suffocating. Passengers who had been reluctant to intervene now carried the quiet fury of those who had seen cruelty unmasked. A woman across the aisle stared directly at him, her lips pressed into a tight line. A man 2 rows behind leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in disapproval. The veterans who had saluted Eldridge remained upright, their shoulders squared, their posture a reminder that respect was earned, not taken. Sterling could feel their gaze burning into him, stripping him of the false power he had wielded so carelessly. The flight attendants, once neutral, had shifted as well. When they passed Sterling's row, they no longer smiled or brushed him off as another demanding passenger. Their expressions hardened, their movements sharper, as though each of them carried the unspoken knowledge of what he had done. One of them collected his empty cup with a clipped motion, her eyes cold as they met his. Another, when delivering items to nearby passengers, did not offer him even a glance. The service he had taken for granted had been replaced by quiet disdain, and Sterling felt it acutely. Eldridge, by contrast, remained composed. He had not spoken a word, had not revealed his identity himself, had not sought to expose Sterling's cruelty. The truth had revealed itself naturally, and in its wake, the older man remained steady, dignified, the embodiment of patience rewarded. He did not gloat or smirk. He did not need to. The justice unfolding around him was not of his making, but of the natural order that arrogance had disturbed. His silence, once mocked, now stood as a monument to strength, and Sterling's frantic movements beside him only amplified the contrast. Passengers began to whisper. They spoke not of Eldridge's endurance, which was plain to see, but of Sterling's collapse. A mother leaned toward her teenage son, shaking her head with disapproval as she gestured toward Sterling's shrinking form. Two businessmen exchanged quiet words, their tone dripping with disdain for the man who had tormented someone so respected. Every whisper carried weight, every murmur another nail in the coffin of Sterling's false authority. He could feel it all around him, pressing closer, suffocating him. Sterling made one last attempt at control. He straightened in his seat, adjusted his jacket, and forced a smirk onto his face as though the exposure meant nothing. But when he reached for his bag, his hand brushed against the sweatshirt he had earlier shaken onto Eldridge's lap, and his expression faltered. He shoved it back quickly, his movements clumsy, his earlier confidence gone. He tried to adjust his headphones, but his hands trembled too much to fit them properly. The performance had ended, and all that remained was a man stripped bare, his cruelty no longer masked by silence. The veterans moved. One of them, a man with a lined face and a stern gaze, rose from his seat and walked slowly down the aisle until he stood near Sterling's row. He did not speak, but his posture, the weight of his presence, spoke louder than words. He turned his back deliberately toward Sterling and sat down beside Eldridge, a gesture of solidarity that cut deeper than any insult. Another followed, shifting seats with the help of a flight attendant, positioning himself close by. They formed a quiet barrier, a wall of respect surrounding Eldridge, leaving Sterling isolated in his shame. The humiliation was complete. Sterling was no longer the center of power in the row. He was a prisoner of his own arrogance, condemned by silence, abandoned by the very indifference he had relied upon. The passengers no longer ignored him. They condemned him with every glance, every whisper, every act of solidarity toward the man he had tried to reduce. His arrogance had once filled the cabin, but now it collapsed inward, suffocating him in the space he had once claimed with such force. Eldridge remained the same as he had always been, calm, composed, dignified. The revelation of his identity had not changed his behavior because his strength had never depended on recognition. It had always been there, steady and unyielding, unseen by Sterling until it was too late. The contrast between them was stark. Sterling, restless and ashamed, shrinking into himself, and Eldridge, tall in spirit, quiet yet commanding, a man whose dignity needed no defense. The descent had begun, the seatbelt sign illuminated overhead, and the final minutes of the flight carried with them the heavy silence of a cabin that had witnessed cruelty, revelation, and judgment. Sterling Vance, who had entered the flight with arrogance overflowing from every gesture, now sat reduced, his shoulders hunched, his smirk vanished, his movements jittery with the weight of humiliation. Eldridge Coleman, the 72-year-old man who had endured hours of insult and torment with a composure that seemed impossible to maintain, remained calm and dignified. His silence, unbroken even after the truth of his identity, had shifted the air in the cabin. The passengers, who had once turned away, now leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the man they had come to respect and the bully they had silently condemned. The balance of power had changed completely, and justice was waiting at the gate. As the landing gear deployed and the plane rattled with the final descent, Sterling grew more restless. He fumbled with his seatbelt, adjusted his jacket, and glanced nervously around the cabin, as if searching for some kind of support or sympathy. None came. Every eye he met turned cold or looked away. Every whisper in the rows behind him sharpened with disapproval. The veterans seated near Eldridge remained upright and firm, their backs deliberately turned to Sterling, creating a barrier that left him isolated. The cabin crew moved with efficiency, but their courtesy extended only to Eldridge and the others. When they passed Sterling, they offered him nothing more than curt glances, their professionalism edged with disdain. Sterling shifted uncomfortably, the reality sinking in that the flight was no longer his stage but his courtroom. The wheels touched down, the plane slowed on the runway, and a ripple of anticipation passed through the cabin as passengers prepared to disembark. For Sterling, those moments were unbearable. He had once filled the air with arrogance, but now he could feel the judgment of the entire cabin pressing in on him, suffocating him. He tried to stand quickly when the seatbelt sign switched off, fumbling for his bag in the overhead compartment. But his clumsy movements betrayed his panic. In his haste, he dropped the same sweatshirt he had earlier used as a weapon against Eldridge, and it landed in the aisle with a dull thud. No one moved to help him. The passengers simply watched as he bent awkwardly to retrieve it, his face burning with shame. Eldridge, by contrast, rose with measured dignity. He did not rush, did not shove, did not glance at Sterling. He simply gathered his belongings with deliberate calm, standing tall despite the cramped aisle. His presence was commanding without effort, his silence echoing louder than any speech could have. The passengers around him moved aside instinctively, creating space for him in a gesture of respect that Sterling could not have demanded even at his most arrogant. The difference between them was laid bare in every motion. One man stripped of false power, the other elevated by quiet dignity. When the door to the aircraft finally opened and the line of passengers began to move, Sterling tried to push forward, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of judgment. But the cabin crew intervened. 2 flight attendants stepped into his path, their expressions firm, their voices calm but authoritative as they instructed him to wait. Sterling froze, panic rising, his earlier bravado gone. He stammered something about needing to leave quickly, but the attendants held their ground. Behind them, visible through the narrow doorway, stood 2 uniformed airport security officers waiting on the jet bridge. Sterling's face drained of color as the reality settled in. His cruelty had not gone unnoticed, and it would not go unpunished. Passengers watched silently as the attendants gestured for Sterling to step aside. He hesitated, his body stiff with shame, but under the weight of every condemning eye in the cabin, he had no choice. He stepped back into his row, clutching his bag, his head lowered. The veterans near Eldridge exchanged subtle nods, their silent approval directed toward the crew who had chosen to act. Justice was unfolding in real time, and it was unmistakable. Eldridge followed the line of passengers calmly, his steps steady, his expression unchanged. He did not look at Sterling, did not speak, did not seek acknowledgement for what he had endured. His dignity did not require an audience. As he stepped into the aisle, the silence of the cabin broke into something powerful. A wave of applause that began with a single passenger and quickly spread until the entire cabin echoed with clapping hands. It was not the applause of entertainment, but of respect, a collective acknowledgement of the strength, patience, and composure of the man who had endured cruelty without surrendering his dignity. Eldridge inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, his calm demeanor unchanged, but the faint glimmer in his eyes betrayed a quiet gratitude. Sterling stood frozen, trapped in the row, his humiliation complete. He could not share the applause, could not join the passengers in their respect. He was the man they had judged, the man they had condemned silently, the man left behind while the cabin honored the victim of his cruelty. The applause grew louder, echoing through the narrow space, until even the flight attendants joined in, their smiles warm as they watched Eldridge make his way toward the exit. Sterling sank back into his seat, clutching his bag, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had believed he could mock dignity without consequence. When Eldridge stepped off the plane, the security officers nodded respectfully to him before turning their attention to Sterling, who stumbled down the aisle moments later, his face pale, his steps unsteady. The passengers who remained watched as he was escorted away, his shoulders hunched, his head lowered. His arrogance dissolved completely. Justice had been delivered, not with shouting or confrontation, but with silence, respect, and the undeniable truth of who Eldridge was and what Sterling had revealed himself to be. The story of the flight would linger in the minds of those who witnessed it. They would remember not just the cruelty of Sterling Vance, but the quiet strength of Eldridge Coleman, the man who endured with dignity and revealed that true authority requires no arrogance, no noise, no spectacle. It resides in patience, in restraint, and in the power to let the truth speak for itself. Sterling had believed he was untouchable, but he left the flight diminished, exposed, and forgotten. Eldridge left the flight honored, respected, and remembered. His silence transformed into a lesson that no passenger in that cabin would forget. The end. If this story held your attention and made you think about how arrogance always collapses in the face of dignity, I'd love for you to support the channel by giving it a like and subscribing so you won't miss the next story. I want to know what you think about the plot. Did the ending deliver the justice you were expecting, or would you have wanted to see it play out differently? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from, whether you're in the US, Europe, or anywhere else. Your feedback helps shape the stories that come next, and I look forward to reading your perspective.